Join us now for Education Matters, a weekly look at the real people and real stories in education across North Carolina.
Welcome to Education Matters, presented by the Public School Forum of North Carolina. I'm Keith Poston. Studies show that children who regularly experience trauma during their young lives score lower than their peers on standardized tests, are more likely to fail a grade, are placed in special education more frequently, and are more likely to be suspended and expelled. Research has helped to answer the question why, and the results may surprise you. The good news is we're also beginning to understand how to address it and help these children succeed in and out of school. We're going to talk challenges and solutions on today's show. Before we tackle our main topic, we open with Edlines, a quick scan of education headlines across North Carolina and the U.S. The impact of the General Assembly's class size mandate is stretching beyond grades K through 3, potentially affecting pre-K and middle and high school classes, as well as thousands of art, music, and PE teachers, as we've discussed on the show before. Our organization, the Public School Forum of North Carolina, reported last week on several school districts, including nearby Warren County, who said they may be forced to shutter their pre-K program in order to use the classroom space to meet the lower caps. Guilford County Schools report they have increased middle school class sizes and spent $8 million already this school year to meet the caps, and will struggle next year to hire the 400 to 500 new elementary school teachers necessary to comply. A nationally recognized expert in school finance cautioned state lawmakers to take their time and get as much input as possible before making any large-scale changes to North Carolina's school funding model. Michael Griffith of the Education Commission of the States shared those thoughts as he presented before the Joint Legislative School Finance Reform Task Force last week. Griffith said unintended consequences can result from a rushed process, and also said adequacy and equity ought to be considered when undertaking such a significant change in how the state funds public education. The new North Carolina Teaching Fellows program created this year by the North Carolina General Assembly has selected the first 5 schools that will participate in the new version of the program. They are Elon University, Meredith College, NC State, UNC Chapel Hill, and UNC Charlotte. We're actually going to have 2 of those deans on next week's show. Finally, the State Board of Education has formally petitioned the North Carolina Supreme Court to take up its nearly year-long lawsuit against the state school superintendent and General Assembly over control of the state's public schools. In July, a 3-judge panel ruled in favor of Superintendent Johnson, but the board appealed. Last month, the North Carolina Supreme Court granted the board's motion for a temporary stay. That stay is in effect until further notice. Most observers, frankly, predicted this matter would ultimately be decided by the Supreme Court. Remember, you can visit the Public School Forum's website at ncforum.org, click Education Matters, and read more about each of the Edlines, as well as other topics we cover each week. As I said at the top of the show, today we're going to talk about childhood trauma and its impact on students. Our first guest is going to help us understand the research. Dr. Katie Rosenbaum, she is the research scholar at the Duke University Center for Child and Family Policy. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
I guess I should say welcome back to the show. You were on about a year ago when the forum had just completed the study on around childhood trauma and learning. So let's just get some definitional things up front.
Absolutely.
What is trauma?
So trauma is not the event itself. It's a person's reaction to an event that is so threatening to them that it overwhelms their ability to cope with it. And that can include things that, like violence in the community and the home, but it also can include things like natural disasters or accidents. And for a child, those threats can be a caregiver who's not able to provide their basic needs due to poverty, due to substance abuse or mental illness, or due to the caregiver being absent from the home.
I think that's the trauma is the response. So that you could actually, you could have, say, children in the same home and something affects them differently.
Very
and you're
differently.
really talking about the effect. All right, the ACEs. Adverse childhood experiences. We're hearing more about that, which is actually, it's a good thing that we're hearing more about it to learn more about it. But so what are ACEs, and sort of comparing that to what is about trauma?
So ACEs kind of come from a different perspective. So instead of thinking about the reaction, an adverse childhood experience just talks about what did you experience as a child. So it started with this landmark study back in the late 1990s when the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente did a study of 17,000 adults and asked them about 10 different categories of adversity, just like the ones that I just mentioned.
Yeah,
that
we've
they may
actually
have
got
experienced.
some coming up on the screen right now so that our
Yeah.
viewers can see the kinds of categories. Go ahead.
So exactly. So they counted up the number of these areas that someone might have experienced in their childhood, and what they found really amazed them, that 64% of the adults in this study reported at least one of these areas of adversity in their childhoods. And in fact, more than 1 in 5, about 22%, reported adversity in 3 or more categories of these ACEs in their childhoods.
Now, why was Kaiser and the Center for Disease Control, I mean, why were they asking people about their childhood experiences in the first place?
Right. Well, you know, what they really wanted to understand is, what impacts do these adverse events have on later outcomes in life? You know, how can we predict how these childhood events might roll out down the road to impact our well-being? And they were astounded to find the direct correlation between the number of adverse events that someone had experienced in their childhood and almost every outcome that they looked at, from substance abuse, obesity, depression, all the way to things like cancer, liver disease, and heart disease risk increased the more adversity you'd experienced as a child.
It's like you said, for an insurance company, they were looking at how, I mean, they're thinking about prevention and how to get, I mean, you and I were talking before we started rolling, the one that jumped out at me and stuck with me is the obesity one, that the physician who was one of the lead researchers on this just started noticing as he was doing sort of family history that he thought it seemed like a lot of them had child sexual abuse in their past, and as it turned out, 55% of his patients who were obese had been abused sexually as children.
Yes, and that was when he first realized there's something going on here and we need to look into it more.
Now, so why does why does it increase risk? I mean, so what happens, or why does this increase the risk of these different things happening to a person as they get older?
So we have to think about what happens in our brains. So when we experience threat, our brains prepare us to go into one of 3 reactions: fight, flight, or freeze. So that means we're either ready to attack, run away, or kind of freeze and hide, become invisible, and not let people see us. And our brains prepare us for that by kind of getting our muscles ready to go, our heart rate goes up, but our thinking brain at the same time kind of shuts down. So language and problem solving is not something that we need to use when we're in a dangerous situation. We just need to react. And
so, I mean, and fight, flight, freeze is actually something, I mean, we were created beautifully that way because it's a good thing, right?
Exactly.
In a normal situation to help us respond to dangerous situations. And then one of the examples that we use in some of the training is we talk about if you're driving your car and all of a sudden someone cuts you off, and that feeling when you get that your heart race, you're tense, but you're reacting, maybe without thinking. And so when for children who are dealing with trauma, that's happening all the time.
So what should happen is the danger goes away and our chemicals go back to normal, and our language and our logic and our thinking skills turn back on again, and we move about our day. But our brains are developed so that the parts we use the most become the strongest. So kids who are experiencing adversity over and over and over again and have this response triggered repeatedly, that part becomes the strongest part of their brain, and they will go into fight, flight, or freeze much more quickly than you or I might.
So what is normal response for them is, I mean, it's not normal, but it's normal for them.
Exactly. And it's protective for them. It's the right way for their brain to work.
And we're talking about not just being stressed and and maybe suffering from depression later in life. You're talking about actual neurological changes, right?
Absolutely. The way that the brain develops changes. And in fact, you can see in kids with significant trauma histories, smaller regions of the brain that deal with language, fewer connections in their brain that deal with problem solving and logical decision making and memory. So it's harder for them to do the kinds of tasks that you might want in a classroom. They're going to have a harder time with the language and the information processing.
So that's what I want to do, sort of the last part before we, is to talk about, so how does it impact a child in school?
Oh gosh. So you're going to see these kids that are going into this fight, flight, or freeze response much more quickly. And it may look like they're not paying attention. They are. They're just paying attention to the wrong things in terms of the educator's perspective. They're looking for danger.
Scanning the horizon, looking for dangers that may not be there, but for them, it feels it's very real.
It's not just like a fight, flight, or freeze response. It is. They're going into this danger response. They're not able to then take in the information and behave in the way that an educator wants them to.
But as children it can still be addressed.
Here's the good news. The good news is, again, our brains are malleable, especially children's brains. So if we can get them feeling safe and help them to build skills, to build those parts of their brain that control their logic and their language and their decision making, we can absolutely change their trajectory and send them in a different path for their futures.
Well, and that's what we're going to talk about
That
in
is
the
our
next
goal.
segment.
That's why we're here.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks.
When we come back, we're going to continue our discussion about childhood trauma, but shift the conversation into solutions, particularly in our schools. But first, see if you can answer this question. According to the landmark CDC Kaiser Permanente study, what is the most prevalent adverse childhood experience?